The sun was setting over Metro City as Captain Sarah Washington finished another long day at the police department. After 15 years on the force, she had earned her position through hard work, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Her dark blue uniform, adorned with the golden captain's bars, reflected her pride in serving her community. It had been an especially tiring Thursday, filled with meetings and paperwork. Sarah's refrigerator at home was nearly empty, so she decided to stop at Green's supermarket on her way home. The store's bright fluorescent lights welcomed her as she grabbed a shopping cart and began walking through the aisles. As she moved through the store, several regular customers greeted her warmly. Evening, Captain Washington called Mrs. Rodriguez, who ran the local bakery. Sarah had helped her grandson stay out of trouble last year by getting him involved in the police department's youth mentoring program. Now the boy was heading to college with a scholarship. Sarah filled her cart with essentials: milk, bread, fresh vegetables, and some chicken for dinner. She also picked up her favorite chocolate cookies, a small reward for completing a challenging week. At the checkout counter, Jenny, the teenage cashier, chatted with her about applying to the police academy while scanning her items. "That'll be $78.45, Captain," Jenny said with a smile. Sarah swiped her card and carefully placed the receipt in her wallet, a habit she had developed over years of managing evidence. She never imagined this simple action would become so important just minutes later. Outside in the parking lot, Officer James Barrett sat in his patrol car, watching the store entrance. He had transferred to Metro City Police Department just 3 months ago from a smaller town. Barrett had his own ways of doing things, ways that hadn't changed despite the department's recent training on community policing and racial sensitivity. When he saw Sarah exit the store with 2 full shopping bags, his eyes narrowed. He didn't notice her captain's uniform or her confident, professional bearing. Instead, his mind immediately jumped to conclusions based on his deep-seated prejudices. He watched as she walked to her car, a well-maintained black Honda Civic. Sarah was just placing her groceries in the trunk when she heard heavy footsteps approaching rapidly from behind. Years of police training made her instinctively alert, but nothing prepared her for what happened next. "Stop right there," a harsh voice commanded. "Turn around slowly and keep your hands where I can see them." Sarah turned, surprised to see a white officer with his hand resting on his holstered weapon. She immediately noticed his badge number, 6472, another habit from years of police work. Even more surprising was that she didn't recognize him, despite her position as captain overseeing all patrol divisions. "Officer, I'm Captain Sarah Washington," she said calmly, maintaining her professional composure. "There seems to be a misunderstanding." She reached slowly toward her police ID, which hung around her neck on a chain. "Don't move," Barrett barked, his face reddening. "I saw you stealing from the store. Don't try to pretend you're a police officer. Where did you get that uniform?" Sarah's heart began racing, but her voice remained steady. "Officer Barrett," she said, reading his nameplate, "I am your superior officer. I have my receipt right here in my wallet, and my police ID is clearly visible. I suggest you lower your voice and think carefully about your next actions." By now, several shoppers had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Mrs. Rodriguez emerged from the store and gasped at what she was witnessing. Jenny, the cashier, pressed her face against the store window, her mouth open in shock. Barrett's response shocked everyone present. "On the ground now," he shouted, drawing his weapon. "You're under arrest for impersonating a police officer and theft." Sarah's mind raced through her options. As a captain, she could forcefully assert her authority. As a black woman facing an armed officer with obvious prejudices, she knew that any sudden movement could be dangerous. As a veteran police officer, she understood that the best course of action was to stay calm and let the situation play out. Everything was on store cameras, and she had dozens of witnesses. In that moment, Sarah made a decision that would change not just her life, but the entire Metro City Police Department. She slowly raised her hands, knowing that what happened next would expose a problem that had been ignored for far too long. The evening air grew thick with tension as Captain Sarah Washington stood in the parking lot with her hands raised. Officer Barrett's weapon remained pointed at her, his finger resting beside the trigger. The gathering crowd watched in stunned silence, and several people had their phones out, recording everything. I'm going to say this one more time. Sarah spoke clearly and calmly, her years of crisis training kicking in. I am Captain Sarah Washington of the Metro City Police Department. My ID is around my neck, and my receipt is in my wallet. There are witnesses who can confirm I paid for everything. Barrett's face twisted with anger. Stop lying. No captain would be shopping here at this time. Get on the ground now. His voice cracked with emotion, revealing his own uncertainty. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward bravely. Officer, please. This is Captain Washington. She comes to our store all the time. I just saw her pay for everything. Stay back. Barrett shouted at Mrs. Rodriguez. This is police business. His hand trembled slightly on his weapon. Just then, Jenny the cashier burst out of the store's front doors, clutching a piece of paper. I have her receipt right here, and the security cameras recorded everything. She called out, her voice shaking with urgency. Barrett ignored them all. Last warning. On the ground, or I'll consider you a threat. Sarah slowly began to kneel, her captain's uniform catching the light of the setting sun. She maintained eye contact with Barrett, her dignity intact despite the humiliation he was putting her through. Officer Barrett, I want you to radio this in. Call for a supervisor, right now. Shut up. Barrett moved closer, pulling out his handcuffs. You don't give me orders. By now, more patrol cars were pulling into the parking lot, their lights flashing. Officers Chen and Rodriguez, who had worked under Sarah for years, jumped out of their vehicle. Their faces showed shock as they recognized their captain on her knees. Captain Washington, Officer Chen called out in disbelief. What's going on here? Barrett turned to them, momentarily confused. Stay back. I'm arresting this woman for impersonating an officer and theft. Officer Rodriguez grabbed his partner's arm. Man, that's our captain. What are you doing? The realization should have hit Barrett then, but his pride and prejudice wouldn't let him back down. Instead, he roughly grabbed Sarah's wrists, slapping the handcuffs on them. The metallic click of the cuffs echoed through the now silent parking lot. You're making a huge mistake, Sarah said quietly, looking Barrett directly in the eyes. Think about what you're doing. It's not too late to handle this professionally. More patrol cars arrived, and Sergeant Mike Thompson, a 20-year veteran, rushed from his vehicle. His face turned pale as he took in the scene, one of his officers handcuffing his direct superior. Barrett, stand down immediately. Thompson's voice boomed across the parking lot. What the hell do you think you're doing? Barrett finally began to realize the gravity of his situation. His hands started shaking as he looked around at his fellow officers' faces, all showing a mix of horror and disgust. But still, he couldn't bring himself to admit his mistake. She was stealing. His voice wavered. And wearing a fake uniform. That's Captain Sarah Washington, you fool. Thompson snapped, rushing forward. I trained her myself when she was a rookie. Release her immediately. The crowd had grown larger, with dozens of phones recording the incident. Someone in the back shouted, "This is going viral. The whole world's gonna see this." As Sergeant Thompson carefully removed the handcuffs from Sarah's wrists, she remained composed, though her eyes blazed with controlled anger. She slowly stood up, adjusted her uniform, and turned to face Barrett, who had finally lowered his weapon and was standing in shocked silence. Officer Barrett, she said, her voice carrying across the parking lot, surrender your weapon and badge to Sergeant Thompson. As of this moment, you are relieved of duty pending a full investigation. She rubbed her wrists where the handcuffs had been too tight, leaving marks on her skin. The other officers moved to surround Barrett, their faces grim. The gravity of what he had done was finally sinking in, but it was too late. His career, and the department's reputation, had just been damaged in ways that would take years to repair. As Sarah looked around at the crowd of witnesses, the phones recording everything, and her fellow officers' concerned faces, she knew this incident would become much bigger than just one racist cop's mistake. This would be the catalyst for change she had been pushing for since making captain. By midnight, the incident at Green's supermarket had exploded across social media. Cell phone videos showing a white officer handcuffing a black female police captain were being shared thousands of times. The Metro City Police Department's phones were ringing non-stop, and news vans had already gathered outside the station. Inside Police Chief David Martinez's office, Captain Sarah Washington sat calmly in a chair, still in her uniform, though she should have been home hours ago. The chief paced back and forth, his face showing a mix of anger and concern. "This is a nightmare, Sarah," he said, running his hands through his graying hair. "I've watched all the videos. That fool Barrett. What was he thinking?" He stopped and looked at her. "How are you holding up?" Sarah straightened in her chair. "I'm angry, Chief. Not just for myself, but for every black person who's gone through something like this without a captain's uniform to protect them." She touched her wrists, which still showed red marks from the handcuffs, "and I'm going to do something about it." In another room of the station, Officer Barrett sat alone, his badge and gun already surrendered. Through the window, he could see other officers walking past, none of them meeting his eyes. Internal Affairs investigators had already taken his initial statement, but he knew this was just the beginning. Sergeant Thompson knocked on the door and entered without waiting for a response. "The chief wants all your passwords for your department accounts and access cards," he said coldly, placing a form on the table. "And your union rep is on his way. You're going to need him." Barrett stared at the form, his hands shaking slightly. "I didn't know she was a captain," he mumbled. "How was I supposed to know?" Thompson's face hardened. "You mean besides her uniform, her ID, the witnesses, the receipt, or maybe the fact that she's been featured in the department newsletter 3 times this year?" He leaned closer. "No, Barrett, the question isn't how you were supposed to know. The question is why you saw a black woman and immediately assumed she was a criminal." Meanwhile, in the store's security office, Detective Lisa Chen was reviewing footage with the night manager. The cameras had captured everything perfectly: Sarah's normal shopping trip, her payment at the register, and Barrett's aggressive confrontation in the parking lot. "We'll need copies of all this," Chen said, taking notes. "And we'll want to interview your cashier, Jenny, first thing in the morning." She paused the footage at a clear shot of Barrett drawing his weapon. "Look at this. No justification at all for escalating to deadly force. He's done." Outside in the parking lot, local news reporter Maria Gonzalez was doing a live broadcast. "We're standing where, just hours ago, Metro City Police Captain Sarah Washington was wrongfully arrested by one of her own officers while simply shopping for groceries. Sources inside the department tell us Officer James Barrett has been relieved of duty pending investigation. Social media is exploding with calls for justice and police reform." Back in Chief Martinez's office, Sarah was laying out her plans. "We need a complete audit of Barrett's arrest history," she said firmly. "Every stop, every ticket, every interaction. And not just here, I want his records from his previous department too." The chief nodded. "Already started, but Sarah, the press is going to be all over this. They'll want to talk to you." "Good," Sarah replied, her voice steady, "because I have something to say. This isn't just about one racist cop, Chief. This is about a system that let him think he could get away with it. How many complaints did his old department ignore? How many other officers are out there doing the same thing?" A knock at the door interrupted them. The department's public information officer entered with a tablet. "Chief, Captain, you need to see this. The videos have gone national. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, they're all running it. And people are digging into Barrett's past. Someone found complaints filed against him at his old department. This is getting bigger by the minute." Sarah stood up, her decision made. "Schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning. It's time to address this head-on." She turned to the chief. "Either we handle this transparently and make real changes, or we lose the community's trust completely. There's no middle ground here." Chief Martinez looked at his captain with newfound respect. Even after everything she'd been through tonight, she was thinking about the bigger picture, about making real change. He nodded slowly. "You'll have full support from me, Sarah, whatever you need." The next morning, the Metro City Police Department's press room was packed with reporters. Camera flashes lit up the room as Captain Sarah Washington stepped up to the podium, wearing her full-dress uniform. Chief Martinez stood supportively behind her left shoulder. Sarah looked directly into the cameras, her voice clear and strong. "Last night, I experienced something that too many people in our community have faced: racial profiling by a police officer who let his prejudice override his judgment. But unlike many victims of such discrimination, I wear this uniform. I hold the rank of captain, and I have the power to do something about it." The room fell silent as she continued. The officer involved, James Barrett, has been relieved of duty. But this morning, I'm announcing something bigger. We discovered disturbing patterns in Officer Barrett's past that should have prevented him from ever wearing our badge. In another part of the city, Barrett sat in his apartment, watching the press conference on TV. His phone had been ringing nonstop, reporters, angry citizens, even his own family questioning his actions. As he watched Sarah speak, his face grew pale at her next words. Our initial investigation has uncovered 17 previous complaints of racial profiling against Officer Barrett from his time at the Riverside Police Department. All of these complaints were buried or dismissed without proper investigation. This stops today. Back at the station, Detective Chen and her team were digging through Barrett's personnel files. They had created a timeline on a large whiteboard, marking every complaint, every suspicious incident. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Look at this, Chen said to her partner, pointing at a cluster of dates. 5 complaints in 1 month, all from Black or Hispanic drivers, all dismissed by his former supervisor, Lieutenant Rogers. She pinned another document to the board. And guess what? Rogers resigned suddenly last year when Barrett transferred here. Sarah's voice continued to ring out from the TV mounted in the corner of their office. We're launching a full investigation into not just Officer Barrett's actions, but also the system that protected him. We're reviewing every arrest he made, every ticket he wrote, every interaction he had with the public. In the community, the impact was immediate. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had witnessed the incident, organized a community meeting at her bakery. The small shop was overcrowded with concerned citizens, community leaders, and local activists. Captain Washington isn't just talking about change. Mrs. Rodriguez told the gathered crowd, she's doing something, but we need to support her. We need to share our own stories. One by one, people began to stand up, sharing similar experiences of profiling and discrimination. Meanwhile, at the Riverside Police Department, Barrett's former workplace, officers were scrambling to contain the fallout. Internal affairs investigators from Metro City had arrived with subpoenas for all of Barrett's records. Lieutenant Rogers, now working as a security consultant, wasn't answering his phone. Back at the press conference, Sarah unveiled the next phase of her plan. Today, I'm announcing the formation of a civilian oversight committee. This committee will have real power, the authority to review officer conduct, recommend disciplinary action, and ensure transparency in all investigations of officer misconduct. Chief Martinez stepped forward to add his support. Captain Washington has my full backing in this initiative. We're also implementing immediate changes to our hiring process. No officer with a history of discriminatory behavior will ever wear our badge. And we're reviewing our current officers' conduct records to ensure we haven't missed similar patterns. As the press conference ended, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Detective Chen. Captain, you need to see this. We found something big in Barrett's old emails. Looks like he and Rogers were part of a private Facebook group sharing racist memes and coordinating how to handle racial profiling complaints. We have screenshots. Sarah looked up from her phone to see more reporters shouting questions. But her mind was already moving forward, planning the next steps. This wasn't just about one bad officer anymore. They had stumbled onto something much bigger, a network of corruption that had allowed racist officers to protect each other. As she left the podium, Sarah knew that the real work was just beginning. Barrett's actions had opened a door, and she was going to walk through it, no matter who tried to stand in her way. The time for real change had finally come. Detective Chen's discovery of the private Facebook group turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg. 3 days after the supermarket incident, Captain Sarah Washington sat in a secure conference room with Chief Martinez, reviewing the shocking evidence spread across the table. We've identified 38 officers across 5 departments who were part of this group, Detective Chen explained, pointing to a map marked with red pins. They called themselves the Old Guard. They shared tips on how to hide discriminatory practices, warned each other about internal investigations, and even coordinated harassment of officers who tried to report misconduct. Sarah picked up a stack of printed screenshots, her face growing darker as she read. They specifically targeted Black and Hispanic neighborhoods for aggressive patrolling. And look at this, they even had a point system for racial profiling stops. Her hands tightened on the papers. Barrett was one of their most active members. Chief Martinez shook his head in disgust. And Lieutenant Rogers from Riverside PD was their ringleader. No wonder all those complaints against Barrett disappeared. He turned to Sarah. You know they're going to fight back hard when this goes public. Let them, Sarah replied firmly. We have everything documented. Detective Chen made sure all the evidence is properly secured and backed up. At that moment, Detective Rodriguez burst into the room. Captain, Chief, you need to see this. Rogers just called an emergency press conference in Riverside. They quickly turned on the conference room TV. Lieutenant Rogers, now wearing a civilian suit, stood at a podium outside the Riverside Police Department. His face showed practiced concern as he spoke to the cameras. The witch hunt being conducted by Metro City Police Department is nothing but a political stunt, Rogers declared. Officer Barrett made an honest mistake, and now Captain Washington is using this incident to advance her own agenda. We stand by Officer Barrett's record of service. Sarah watched calmly as Rogers continued his defense. When he finished, she turned to her team. He's scared. He knows we have the evidence. Now watch what happens next. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick text. Within minutes, every major news outlet received an anonymous email containing screenshots from the Old Guard group. The images showed Rogers and Barrett openly discussing how to target minority communities and cover up complaints. The hashtag Old Guard Exposed started trending within hours. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Mrs. Rodriguez's bakery had become an unofficial headquarters for community action. People lined up to file formal statements about past encounters with Barrett and other officers named in the Facebook group. Civil rights attorneys worked pro bono, helping victims document their experiences. Each story follows the same pattern, one attorney explained to Sarah during her visit to the bakery. Traffic stops without cause, aggressive questioning, searches without consent, all targeting people of color. Some victims were too afraid to complain before, but now they're coming forward. Back at the station, Barrett finally broke under questioning. Rogers told me I'd be protected, he admitted to internal affairs investigators. He said Metro City was too soft, that they needed officers who weren't afraid to be proactive. He promised to handle any complaints like he did in Riverside. Sarah received the news of Barrett's confession while meeting with her newly formed Civilian Oversight Committee. The diverse group included community leaders, civil rights advocates, and retired judges who have volunteered to serve. Barrett's confession is just the beginning, Sarah told the committee. We're not just removing bad officers, we're changing the entire culture that protected them. Every complaint will be investigated. Every victim will be heard. And every officer will be held accountable. As she spoke, more evidence kept arriving. Officers from other departments, inspired by Sarah's stand, began coming forward with their own stories of witnessing discrimination and corruption. The Old Guard network was unraveling rapidly. Chief Martinez appeared at the door. Sarah, the FBI just called. They want to open a federal investigation into civil rights violations. Rogers and his whole network are about to go down. Sarah nodded, thinking about how her humiliating experience in the supermarket parking lot had led to this moment. What Barrett and Rogers didn't understand was that they hadn't just picked on a black woman. They had challenged a captain who had spent her career preparing to fight exactly this kind of corruption. Tell the FBI we'll give them everything we have, she said. It's time to show everyone what real justice looks like. 1 week after Barrett's confession, the scene at the federal building in Metro City was intense. FBI agents carried boxes of evidence through the lobby while reporters camped outside, waiting for news. On the 5th floor, Captain Sarah Washington sat in a conference room with federal prosecutors, explaining how a routine shopping trip had exposed years of systemic racism in multiple police departments. The evidence is overwhelming, said FBI Special Agent Marcus Torres, spreading files across the table. We've identified over 200 cases where Barrett, Rogers, and their network falsified reports to justify discriminatory arrests. Some of these people are still in jail based on their testimony. Sarah leaned forward, examining a document. We need to prioritize reviewing those cases. These aren't just files. They're people's lives that were destroyed by corrupt officers. Across town, at the Riverside Police Department, federal agents were leading Lieutenant Rogers out in handcuffs. His face had lost its confident smirk as reporters shouted questions. His private Facebook group had turned out to be a goldmine of evidence, documenting years of coordinated discrimination and cover-ups. Mark Rogers, you're under arrest for civil rights violations, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice, the FBI agent announced loudly, making sure the cameras caught every word. It was a dramatic fall for the man who had protected racist officers for so long. Back at Metro City Police Department, Chief Martinez was addressing his officers in the briefing room. The atmosphere was tense as he explained the changes coming to the department. Thanks to Captain Washington's leadership, we're implementing new policies effective immediately, he announced. Every officer will wear a body camera at all times. All complaints will be reviewed by the Civilian Oversight Committee, and we're establishing an anonymous reporting system for officers to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but others nodded in approval. The department was changing, and they needed to change with it or find another job. In her office, Detective Chen was interviewing a young officer who had come forward with new information. After seeing what Captain Washington did, I can't stay quiet anymore, the officer said nervously. Last year, I saw Rogers and Barrett meet with officers from 3 other departments. They were planning how to coordinate their patrols to target specific neighborhoods. Sarah walked in just as the officer finished speaking. "Thank you for coming forward," she said warmly. "This is exactly the kind of courage we need to fix our broken system." Meanwhile, at Mrs. Rodriguez's bakery, a celebration was underway. The community had gathered to watch Rogers' arrest on TV, and the mood was jubilant. Jenny, the young cashier who had tried to help Sarah that night at the supermarket, was there too. Captain Washington didn't just fight for herself, Jenny told a local reporter. She fought for everyone who's ever been profiled or discriminated against. She showed us that one person can make a real difference. The media coverage had gone national. Major news networks ran special reports on the old guard scandal, highlighting how Sarah's incident had exposed a network of corrupt officers across multiple departments. Civil rights organizations praised her courage and leadership. At the courthouse, Barrett sat with his lawyer, negotiating a plea deal. In exchange for his testimony against Rogers and other members of the old guard, he would receive a reduced sentence. His face showed defeat as he signed the agreement. "I want to apologize to Captain Washington," he said quietly to the prosecutor. "I let my prejudices control my actions and I was wrong." The prosecutor nodded, but they both knew an apology couldn't undo years of discrimination. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Chief Martinez. "The mayor wants to see you." "It's good news." She smiled, knowing what was coming. The department needed new leadership, someone who could continue the reforms she had started. As she drove to City Hall, Sarah passed the supermarket where everything had started. The parking lot looked ordinary now, but that night had changed everything. Barrett's mistake hadn't just exposed corruption, it had created an opportunity for real change. A group of young black children waved at her police car as she stopped at a light. They had seen her on TV, standing up against discrimination. To them, she wasn't just a captain anymore. She was proof that justice was possible, that the system could be changed from within. Sarah waved back, knowing that her work was far from over. But for the first time in years, she felt real hope for the future of policing in her city. 1 month after Rogers' arrest, the Metro City Police Department looked very different. Captain Sarah Washington, now Deputy Chief Washington, stood at the front of the training academy's main hall, addressing a room full of officers. The walls behind her displayed new posters about community policing, bias recognition, and accountability. "Today marks the beginning of our department's transformation," Sarah announced to the assembled officers. "Every one of you will complete this new training program. It's not just about following rules, it's about changing how we think about our role in the community." The training program she had developed was unlike anything the department had seen before. Community members who had experienced discrimination shared their stories directly with officers. Civil rights attorneys explained the legal and human costs of biased policing. And body camera footage from Barrett's previous arrests was used to show how prejudice could cloud an officer's judgment. In another room, Detective Chen was leading a technology training session. "Your new body cameras will activate automatically when you exit your vehicle," she explained to a group of patrol officers. The footage uploads directly to a secure server that the Civilian Oversight Committee can access. No more missing videos, no more convenient equipment failures. Some veteran officers grumbled about the changes, but most embraced the new direction. Officer Maria Santos, a rookie who had just completed the new training, approached Sarah after the session. "Deputy Chief," she said eagerly, "your experience changed how I think about being a police officer. We're not just here to enforce laws, we're here to protect everyone's rights." The impact extended far beyond Metro City. Police departments across the country were requesting copies of Sarah's training program. The FBI had created a special task force to investigate other potential networks of discriminatory officers, using the old guard case as a model. At the federal courthouse, the prosecutions continued. Rogers sat through another day of testimony, watching his former allies turn against him one by one. Barrett's detailed confession had started a chain reaction, with more officers coming forward daily to admit their involvement in discriminatory practices. Sarah visited the courthouse to observe the proceedings. During a break, the lead prosecutor pulled her aside. "Because of your case, we're reviewing every conviction these officers were involved in," she explained. "So far, we've identified 50 people who were wrongly convicted. They're being released and their records cleared." Back at Mrs. Rodriguez's bakery, now officially designated as a community outreach center, Sarah met with former victims of police discrimination. The walls were covered with newspaper articles about the case and photos of community meetings. Mrs. Rodriguez had even named a cookie after Sarah, the captain's justice cookie. "6 months ago, I was afraid every time I saw a police car in my neighborhood," one community member told Sarah. "Now, I see officers stopping to talk with kids, attending community events, really trying to understand us. You made this happen." Sarah smiled, but she knew the work wasn't finished. Later that day, she met with her expanded Civilian Oversight Committee. The diverse group now included former police officers who had reported misconduct, civil rights activists, and community leaders. "The numbers don't lie," reported committee chair Dr. James Wilson, showing charts on a screen. "Complaints of racial profiling have dropped by 70%, use of force incidents are down by 60%, and community trust scores have doubled." But the most significant change was happening at the police academy. Sarah had completely reformed the recruitment and training process. Every potential officer now underwent extensive background checks and bias screening. The training included weeks of community immersion, where cadets lived in different neighborhoods and learned about the communities they would serve. "Remember why we're here," Sarah told a class of new recruits. "What happened to me in that parking lot wasn't unique. The only unique thing was that I had the power to do something about it. Now each of you has that same power and responsibility." That evening, as Sarah left the academy, she passed the wall of photos in the main hallway. Among the pictures of graduating classes and honored officers, there was a new addition, a frame containing Barrett's badge number and a simple caption, "Never again." Her phone buzzed with a message from Chief Martinez. "National Police Chiefs Association wants you to keynote their conference. Your reforms are going nationwide." Sarah smiled, thinking about how a moment of humiliation had turned into a movement for change. Outside, the sun was setting over Metro City. In neighborhoods that had once feared the police, children waved at passing patrol cars. Officers stopped to chat with residents, learning their names and concerns. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was progress. Real, lasting progress that would continue long after the headlines faded. Last edited. 1 year after the supermarket incident, Deputy Chief Sarah Washington stood in front of Green Supermarket, but this time she wasn't alone. Hundreds of people had gathered for the opening of the new Community Police Relations Center, built right next door to where her wrongful arrest had taken place. 1 year ago, on this spot, an officer's prejudice led to my humiliation. Sarah addressed the crowd, her voice strong and clear. Today, we stand here not to remember the pain, but to celebrate the change that grew from it. The crowd included faces both familiar and new. Mrs. Rodriguez was there, her bakery having become a model for community police partnerships across the city. Jenny, the cashier who had tried to help Sarah that night, was now a cadet in the police academy, inspired by Sarah's example. Inside the new center, walls displayed photographs telling the story of transformation. One section showed Barrett's arrest and Rogers' trial. Both men had received significant prison sentences for their roles in the Old Guard conspiracy. Another section celebrated the release of 52 wrongfully convicted individuals who had been targeted by corrupt officers. Chief Martinez, now approaching retirement, took the podium after Sarah. "When I promote Deputy Chief Washington to Chief of Police next month, I'll do so knowing that our department's future is in the best possible hands," he announced, drawing loud cheers from the crowd. The changes Sarah had implemented had spread far beyond Metro City. 23 police departments across the country had adopted her training program. The FBI had used her case to uncover and dismantle similar discriminatory networks in 12 other cities. Her story was now taught in police academies as an example of how to transform tragedy into institutional change. Detective Chen, recently promoted to captain, led tours through the center's training facilities. "Every officer in our department now undergoes quarterly bias recognition training," she explained to visitors. "Our body camera compliance rate is 100%, and our civilian oversight program has become a national model." The most powerful part of the center was the Voice of Change room, where visitors could hear testimonies from both police officers and community members about how the reforms had affected their lives. "I used to teach my children to be afraid of the police," one recorded testimony played. "Now I teach them that police officers are here to protect everyone, regardless of their color. My son wants to be an officer when he grows up." Sarah walked through the center, stopping to talk with community members and officers. A small group of children gathered around her, asking questions about her captain's bars and chief's stars. She knelt down to their level, remembering how important it was for them to see someone who looked like them in a position of authority. Outside, the afternoon sun caught the center's motto, carved in stone above the entrance: "Justice serves all." Below it, a plaque told the story of that night 1 year ago, ending with the words, "From one moment of injustice grew a movement for change." Officer Maria Santos, who had completed Sarah's first training class, approached with exciting news. "Deputy Chief, the community satisfaction surveys just came in. Trust in the police department has reached its highest level in 30 years. Sarah nodded, but her attention was on a scene across the street. A patrol officer had stopped to help an elderly black woman with her groceries, carrying them to her car while chatting warmly. Such scenes had become common in Metro City, but each one still touched her heart. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah received a surprising message. It was from Barrett, writing from prison. "I watch the news and see the changes you've made. I was wrong about everything. Thank you for turning my mistake into something positive for everyone." The day ended with a community dinner in the center's courtyard. Officers and residents sat together, sharing meals and stories. Children played safely in the streets, and patrol cars drove by with windows down, officers waving and greeting people by name. Later that night, as Sarah prepared to leave, she paused at her old captain's uniform, now displayed in a case in the center's lobby. Next to it was a simple receipt from Green's supermarket, the one that had started it all. "Deputy Chief?" A young black girl approached her shyly. "When I grow up, I want to be just like you." Sarah smiled, remembering her own childhood dreams of making a difference. "Remember," she told the girl, "sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. All you need is the courage to stand up for what's right." As she drove home under the stars, Sarah knew that her work wasn't finished. But she had shown that one person's stand against injustice could transform an entire system. The supermarket incident hadn't just changed her life, it changed the future of policing itself.